Hey everyone, so today I'll be doing an oil change on the Raptor. Now before I get started, I just want to cover the tools and materials needed for this process. Obviously with an oil change, you're going to need oil and a filter. I'll be running Pennzoil Ultra Platinum Full Synthetic. This is a really good Group 3 engine oil, and I'll be running it in the factory recommended 5W30. Now this truck only takes 6 quarts of oil, but I like to have extra since I buy it in bulk, and these turbo engines tend to burn a little bit of oil. Also be running the factory recommended Motorcraft FL-500s oil filter. I think these Motorcraft filters are very good for what they are. And I'll also need a strap wrench to get the old filter off. I also have a maintenance record for all my vehicles to know what was done, when it was done, and at what mileage, and I can keep a record of it. A funnel for getting the oil back in, as well as having a rag handy for oil changes, is always beneficial. Now, I also wear a set of disposable rubber gloves when I do oil changes to keep my hands clean. I don't wear work gloves or mechanics gloves. Typically, if you get oil on them, it is very difficult to get it out. Now, for these second-gen Raptors, there's a little bit of a difference depending on the year of your truck for the oil change. On the early second-gen Raptor 17 and early 18, Ford used a plastic oil pan, and they used one of these yellow plugs for the oil sump, similar to the one that's on my 350R. If you have a later truck, about a mid-18 to 20, it has a metal pan. It's going to use a traditional bolt, and you have a 15mm socket that you need for that. So that's really the only variance with this oil change. Now, before you get started, there's a couple of access panels that have to come off. Because this truck has so many skid plates on it, you wouldn't be able to get to them without having to remove these access panels. To access the oil filter itself, you have this panel. This is on the front driver's side of the skid plate. This has 5 equal length T40 Torx bolts. Since they're equal length, you don't have to worry about screwing them up. That's not a big deal. They're all the same. And then to access the actual drain for the oil sump itself, you have 3 10mm bolts, also the same length, so you don't have to worry about screwing them up. And this panel is just behind the passenger side front tire. And this has remove for oil change stamped into the steel itself. And I just use my electric ratchet for running these bolts in and out. Makes it a little bit quicker. And then for an oil change, I always have 2 pans. The smaller one I use for the oil filter, so I can let that drain simultaneously while I'm draining the main sump itself. And then because it looks like the oil drain doesn't line up perfectly with the access panel, it might drip a little bit onto the top of the skid plate. So I'm going to use my Forma funnel just to make a little bit of a ramp so it doesn't leak underneath the skid plate itself. So now that I have everything I need, let's go ahead and get started. So with the strap wrench, as with any other spin-on oil change, slip it over and it starts to turn. Not too hard. There's actually a fair amount of room in here. That access panel they built into the skid plate is actually pretty good. All right, that should be good enough to get with my hand. Now, if you look below the filter, you can see that little plastic thing. That is actually a little ramp that the oil runs down so it doesn't end up running underneath the skid plate itself. Now, I've seen a lot of people put these trucks up on the front wheels up on ramps when they do oil changes. The problem is this little basic ramp that's built in for the oil to run down. Oh, but some of it ran towards the back. Typically, it'll all run towards the back if you put the truck up on ramps, and it's not going to end up running out the correct way. So a little bit of it ran out the back. Once I take the oil filter off, the bulk of it's probably going to run out the front. So it just spins on like any other oil filter. All right, so didn't spill any, but there probably might be a little bit left once the filter itself is done dripping. So I'll let this just sit for a little while. While this is dripping, I will start draining out the oil sump itself. So I already went ahead and just cracked the sump loose with that 15mm. And I just used my Forma funnel to build a ramp because this doesn't look like it lines up perfectly and looks like it's going to end up draining under the skid plate. So I'll just let it run down this and hopefully this will work. will be a little bit more difficult if you have one of the early trucks because the oil comes out really fast with those plastic pans with the oil plugs, the yellow plugs rather. So here we go. Almost out. Perfect. All right, that actually worked really good. I highly recommend these Forma funnels. And this has a little plug on the back side of the plug itself. I want to also make sure I check the gasket on the oil filter. That came off no problem. Oh, this is actually working really good. It's going to take a little bit longer to drain because this hole is not nearly as large as the ones with the plastic pans, but that's okay. So this seems to be a lot more controllable. Oh, this is actually working perfect. I used to use aluminum foil for jobs like this, but these Forma funnels are pretty good. I think I paid about $30 for this thing. I used it on my 350R. And this is definitely a very convenient thing to have for some oddball oil changes, especially when on some of the small equipment, when the plugs are located in weird spots. So I'll let this thing sit for a few minutes, button everything up, and we'll be almost done. All right, well, I let everything drain for a few minutes just to try to get as much out as possible. I always like to pre-fill the oil filters. That's always a good idea. Since this sits sideways, I'm not going to fill it up all the way. Probably fill it up about halfway or so I don't lose any when I'm spinning it back on. This has the pleating inside. It's going to absorb a considerable amount of oil. So this come up. That should be good enough. Also use a little bit of the excess oil I put on that typically you can spill on the sides just to lubricate the gasket so that it comes off next time without sticking to the engine block. So let everything drain for a few more minutes and then we'll be ready to button everything back up. All right, so a little bit of residual still dripping. That's okay. We're close enough. So we'll just spin it on just like any other spin-on oil filter. No tools required. You gotta kind of do this by feel. You really can't see, but you should be able to feel it when the threads start to grab. And that feels like it. There we go. Beautiful, there we go. All right. Perfect. All right, so I'll use my right hand. Once you feel the gasket contact, it's usually 3/4 to 1 full turn. That's pretty much the standard for spin-on filters. Don't put a wrench on this, you'll over-torque it. All right, that feels pretty good. Feels good. I'll just leave the access panels off after I do the initial start just to check for leaks. But now we go ahead and button up the sump and start putting oil back in it. So this has been dripping for a while now. I think that's sufficient. There's really not much left coming out of here. So just thread this back on. The yellow drain sumps on the early Raptors, they don't have a torque spec. They just have like years on them that they lock into, just like my 350R does. This, I believe the torque spec is 19 pounds. So if you want to break out your torque wrench, if you're not too sure what about 19 pounds feels like, you can go ahead and do that. All right, so this Forma funnel actually worked really well. I don't think it just spilled any oil under it. That is absolutely perfect. Just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna snug this up by feel. Extension probably make this a little bit easier, but I can make do with this. This isn't too bad. There we go. All right, don't have to go crazy. All right, that looks pretty good. So I'll start refilling this thing with oil. I'll run the engine, check for leaks, and reset the oil maintenance reminder. All right, now it's time to refill it. Now, it says 6 quarts in the book. It's a good idea to go by the dipstick, because I've owned several vehicles where it took a different amount than what was said in the book. And I've had pretty much every mechanic ever tell me to go by the dipstick, not the book. So I'll start off with about 6 quarts or so, and then I will go from there. So I'll let this sit for a little while. This was a 5-quart jug. I'll put 1 more quart from the other 5-quart jug in, and then we'll see where we're at. Good. All right, now with everything buttoned up, the oil filter is tight, the sump bolt is tight, and I have the cap on the oil fill. Make sure you put the cap on the oil fill before you ever start an engine, or it makes an absolute mess. So before I do the initial fire up, I'll do an engine priming. This is not a necessity, but it's not a bad idea. So let's wake the truck up. I'm going to put my foot on the brake, and I'm going to hold the accelerator to the floor at the same time and push and release the start button. And it's going to cycle the engine on the starter without introducing fuel. So you saw that oil pressure gauge on the left jump up. So now we have oil pressure. So now we started as normal. Foot on the brake and push the start button. So as you can see on the left, we have excellent oil pressure. There's no warnings for the oil pressure. So that's good. So I'll just get out. I will double check my oil level after I let this run for about 30 seconds, check for leaks. If everything's good, I will button everything back up, put those access panels back on, fill out my maintenance log, and I also need to reset the oil life indicator. All right, so the truck is now filled with oil. It ended up taking about an extra quarter of a quart or so. Not a lot, but I like to have the max amount of oil in the engine. Now, if you have a Raptor and you're experiencing excessive oil consumption, there is a TSB available from Ford for that. I had it done on this truck early on. This truck was eating a lot of oil. I had the TSB redone, which for this truck was just a reflash, and it made a significant difference. It now eats considerably less oil. I really don't even need to add oil in between oil changes anymore. So, and now this is not a factory equipped item, but I have an aftermarket JLT air oil separator on mine. So basically any of the oil that comes through the PCV system gets caught. Now this is not from one oil change. I have opened this up before and emptied it out when I first got it, and I was kind of checking. This is about 1,000 miles or so, maybe a little bit more on the oil. So there is a little bit in the oil separator. I could probably get away with going an entire oil change without emptying it, but I just kind of like to keep an eye on it so by chance it does not become overfilled. This is designed to hold about 3 ounces of oil. So as you can see, there wasn't a ton in there, but that's a very popular aftermarket accessory, especially for these Raptors with the turbocharged engines, with the blow-by that you get from these. This keeps that oil from going back into the intake charge. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.